Dear economics teachers, as you now know, climate change is one of the most significant issues of our times, and its impacts are becoming inseparable from our day-to-day lives. It is critical that our students are made aware of this issue and that they understand this problem from different disciplinary perspectives. In this lecture, we show the link between economics and climate change and show you how you can teach some topics in economics using a climate-related example. We present educational resources that bring climate studies into the mainstream undergraduate economics curriculum. These resources will allow you teachers to teach topics in economics using climate-related examples without deviating from your prescribed syllabus. This will lead to an increased climate awareness amongst your students. Again, I'd like to reiterate, you can continue to teach topics in economics as per your syllabus, but the use of these educational resources that use climate-related examples will lead to a greater awareness of climate change amongst your students, which is one of the most critical issues of our time. You can use these different digital pedagogical tools presented here in your economics classroom and learn how to incorporate a multidisciplinary approach to teaching. How do you introduce relevant topics, in this case climate change, in your discipline? How do you effectively use technology in your classroom? And how do you enhance your student learning? You can integrate climate science in your teaching and use the educational resources shown here to teach topics such as the economics of climate change, cost-benefit analysis, tragedy of the commons, carbon emissions abatement, marginal abatement cost, global economy and energy, economics and geopolitics of oil, carbon taxes, trade policies, cap and trade, supply-demand analysis, prisoner's dilemma, principal-agent problems, and more. Let us take a look at a few lesson plans that integrate topics in economics with climate-related examples. These include a lesson plan on carbon pricing, shadow and market prices, one on cost-benefit analysis, one on the tragedy of the commons, and another on poverty and climate change. A lesson plan titled Carbon Pricing, Shadow and Market Prices. As an undergraduate economics teacher, you can use this lesson plan to teach your students about carbon pricing, the instruments to implement it, that is carbon tax and cap, and trade emissions trading systems. This lesson plan will include resources to help your students understand the importance of shadow price in the cost-benefit analysis of carbon pricing. This will enable your students to understand how carbon emissions, one of the main drivers of climate change, are related to global economics. So, if you are teaching topics such as environmental economics, carbon pricing, carbon tax, emission trading systems, cost-benefit analysis, shadow prices, market prices, social costs, marginal abatement costs, and so on and so forth, we invite you to take a closer look at this lesson plan. This lesson plan includes a reading that introduces and describes the different aspects of global carbon pricing and its importance as an instrument for climate policies. Another reading that introduces the topic of shadow and market prices to explain concepts such as social cost of carbon, shadow price of carbon, and marginal abatement costs in the context of internal carbon pricing. This is with respect to the United Kingdom. There is an interactive visualization tool which has a map, data, and graphs to understand the carbon pricing initiatives of various nations over a 30-year period. Here is a step-by-step guide provided to you to teach this topic in your economics classroom or laboratory. Please feel free to customize this lesson plan according to your requirements. Introduce the topic using the reading titled Carbon Pricing Dashboard by the World Bank to introduce the topic of carbon pricing. There is an embedded video which is titled Climate Countdown Carbon Pricing by Connect for Climate, which is about 5 minutes long, to explain the importance of carbon pricing. In this reading, you may be able to describe to your students what is carbon pricing, what are the main types of carbon pricing, and why is it important for governmental or organizational policy making. The text here can also help your students to distinguish between international and national or subnational or regional carbon pricing. Make sure to introduce the concept of internal carbon pricing and the factors that determine it. You can now extend the understanding using the reading titled The Social Cost of Carbon and the Shadow Price of Carbon. What are they and how to use them in an economic appraisal in the UK. In this reading, you can have your students understand the need for climate-informed policies in the economic assessment of a country. Given its significance in greenhouse gas emissions, use carbon as an example to explain the social costs of carbon and its shadow price in internal carbon pricing. Compare the marginal abatement cost and social costs of carbon for different stabilization goals as determined by the Stern Review. Finally, introduce the concepts of discounting and discount rates for calculating carbon prices. This reading uses the United Kingdom as an area of study, but it can be discussed in the context of other countries as well. Now, you can use the interactive map and data titled Carbon Pricing Dashboard, which is by the World Bank, to visualize the information available on the carbon pricing initiatives that has been implemented by different nations over the last 30 years. Instructions of how to conduct this activity are provided in this lesson plan. Questions and assignments that you can have your students answer using this lesson plan. Carbon pricing is used as an instrumentation for making climate policies. Explain this. What is the difference between market prices and shadow prices? What is the importance of shadow pricing in evaluating the costs of greenhouse gases? In the context of climate change, what are discount rates, marginal abatement cost, and statistical value of life? The learning outcomes. This lesson plan will enable your students to effectively 1. Explain the concept and importance of pricing carbon. 2. Evaluate carbon pricing as an instrument for climate policy packaging. 3. Describe shadow prices in environmental economics. Distinguish between shadow price, social cost, and market price, and be able to define discount rates, marginal abatement costs, and statistical value of life. If you or your students would like to explore this topic in more detail, these additional resources can be useful. A lesson plan titled Teaching Cost-Benefit Analysis Through Climate-Related Examples. As an undergraduate economics teacher, you can use this lesson plan to help you in teaching about cost-benefit analysis, which should be part of your syllabus in undergraduate economics curriculum. In this lesson plan, you can help your students understand what are the principles of cost-benefit analysis. The activities that are shown in this lesson plan will allow your students to apply cost-benefit analysis to global climate change and to carbon abatement, which is an action to mitigate climate change. So, if you are teaching cost-benefit analysis, carbon abatement, or energy economics and climate change, we invite you to take a closer look at this lesson plan. This lesson plan has a reading that introduces the principle of cost-benefit analysis, another reading to discuss the economic analysis of climate change, specifically the cost-benefit studies of global climate change, a classroom lab activity, an interactive way to engage your students to actually perform cost-benefit analysis on carbon emissions abatement. Here is a step-by-step guide towards the use of this lesson plan in your economics classroom or laboratory. Please feel free to customize the lesson plan to your preferences and requirements. First, use the reading titled An Introduction to Cost-Benefit Analysis to introduce the topic and its principles. This reading is titled An Introduction to Cost-Benefit Analysis, has been produced by Watkins from the San Jose State University. Next, introduce the economic analysis of climate change and discuss with your students the cost-benefit studies of global climate change. You can use the reading titled Economic Analysis of Climate Change, Cost-Benefit Studies of Climate Change from a reading titled The Economics of Global Climate Change. This has been written by Jonathan Harris, Roach, and Coder from the Global Development and Environmental Institute at the Tufts University. This reading explores and compares methodology that is used by various economic models for cost-benefit analysis of climate change. Instructions of which sections to stress on are provided in this lesson plan. You can explore this topic further through a hands-on activity titled Abating Carbon Emissions to actually perform cost-benefit analysis for carbon emissions abatement. This classroom lab activity is titled Abating Carbon Emissions has been developed by Gautam Sethi from Bard College, Kurt Jervich from SUNY Pittsburgh, and Robin Smith from Bard College, and is available at the Science Education Resource Center, SERC of Carleton College. In this activity, carbon abatement is considered to be an action that will mitigate climate change, and the cost benefits of abating carbon emissions are indeed calculated. All instructions of how to use this are provided in this particular link. There is teaching material that you can download, associated reading material, and the activities of what you can conduct in your classroom are also shown here. Questions and assignments you can ask your students include: explain the principles of cost-benefit analysis. What are the possible limitations of measuring the costs of climate change in terms of the GDP? How can cost-benefit analysis be applied to carbon emissions abatement? The learning outcomes. This lesson plan will enable your students to describe cost-benefit analysis, apply cost-benefit analysis to global climate change, and apply cost-benefit analysis to carbon emissions abatement. If you or your students would like to explore this topic in more detail, some of these additional resources may be useful for you. Teaching the tragedy of the commons using climate change. As an undergraduate economics teacher, you can use this lesson plan to teach the concept of the tragedy of the commons, which is often included in the undergraduate economics syllabus. This lesson plan will help your students understand what is the tragedy of the commons, to identify the commons and the tragedy in some example problems. In the activity of this lesson plan, students will examine climate change as a tragedy of the commons and will discuss possible economic solutions for the problem. So, if you are teaching tragedy of the commons or just the economics of climate change, we invite you to take a closer look at this lesson plan. This lesson plan includes a short video micro lecture that first introduces what is the concept of the tragedy of the commons and provides examples to explain these terms, tragedy and commons. A classroom or a lab activity to further understand the tragedy of the commons through case studies, to discuss Earth's atmosphere as a commons and global warming as a tragedy and what might be solutions. A reading that discusses climate change, a tragedy of the commons problem, that is, atmospheric sinks for greenhouse gases are the commons. It provides an overview of current climate change governance, describes polycentric governance strategies to address global climate change at various levels. A step-by-step guide is provided for the usage of this lesson plan in your economics classroom or laboratory. Please feel to modify this as per your requirements. First, introduce the topic through a video micro lecture titled Tragedy of the Commons to introduce this concept itself. This video micro lecture is delivered by Dr. Jonathan Tomkin from a course titled Introduction to Sustainability, which is produced by the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and is available on Coursera. Using this particular video, have a brief discussion amongst your students to cite examples of tragedy of the commons problems and to identify what might be the commons and what might be the tragedy in each example. Next, explore the topic in further detail through a classroom laboratory activity titled Introducing the Economic Concept of Tragedy of the Commons Using Global Warming. This classroom lab activity has been developed by Laura Triplett and is available on SERC's portal at the link shown here. In this activity, your students will discuss case studies for different tragedy of the commons problems. They will examine the Earth's atmosphere as a commons and global warming as a tragedy and will propose economic solutions to solve this problem. All instructions of how to use this resource are provided in the link shown here. Next, discuss the solutions through a reading. You can have your students read a reading titled Climate Change, the Ultimate Tragedy of the Commons, which is written by Pavola in Poverty of Land and Other Resources and is shown at the link provided here. In this reading, your students can learn about climate change as a tragedy of the commons problem, where the atmosphere sinks for greenhouse gases are the commons, and can analyze the current state of climate change governance. It also discusses polycentricity as a governance approach to address global climate change at various levels and scales. It provides specific examples of the Cities for Climate Change program and the Cement Sustainability Initiative. Further information about this tool is provided in the link of this lesson plan. Questions and assignments you can ask your students through this lesson plan include: describe the concept of the tragedy of the commons. Discuss climate change as a tragedy of the commons problem. Identify the common and the tragedy. Explain why atmospheric sinks for greenhouse gases can be considered as a commons. Discuss different types of governance solutions for climate change as a tragedy of the commons. The learning outcomes. This lesson plan will enable your students to be able to 1. Describe tragedy of the commons, provide examples of this problem, identify the commons and tragedy in given problems, examine climate change as a tragedy of the commons problem, and propose economic solutions for the climate change tragedy of the commons issue. If you or your students would like to explore this topic further, some of these additional resources may be useful for you. Poverty and climate, an inextricable link. As an undergraduate economics teacher, you can use this lesson plan to teach about poverty, the impact of climate change on global poverty, and ways to manage it in the current and future scenarios. This lesson plan will include resources to show to your students how poverty is being exacerbated by climate change and what are the measures needed to manage it using guidelines provided by the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. So, if you are teaching topics such as poverty, that includes absolute or extreme poverty, the poverty cycle, human development, sustainable development goals, and so on and so forth, we invite you to take a closer look at this lesson plan. It includes a reading that defines what is poverty, poverty in the context of a country's economy, causes for poverty, and specifies the examples of Southeast Asian countries. It also describes the relationship of climate change and poverty and strategies to counteract the impacts of climate change. A short story which is based on a report of the World Bank that describes the threat of climate change to poor people and ways to offset it through adaptation and mitigation strategies. This lesson plan includes a step-by-step user guide that you may use in your classroom. First, use a chapter reading titled Impact of Climate Change on Poverty, which is from a teacher's guidebook on climate change titled Integrating Climate Change Issues in Southeast Asian Schools by Simeo. You can use this reading to first define to your students what is poverty and the fact that poverty and the definition of it may not be the same for all nations. It is based on a country's individual level of economic progress. When you look or have your students understand the causes of poverty, parameters like access to food, water, shelter, healthcare, infrastructure, education, all of these which define the state of the well-being or poverty of a nation's population. You can use this text and the causes for various proportions of poor people in different nations, but can emphasize the Southeast Asian countries, which is shown in this particular reading. You can also discuss with your students how poverty disproportionately affects women, children, and the elderly, making them far more vulnerable. Now, the main thing that we would like you to emphasize is what is the relationship between poverty and climate change? How are they interconnected? And this reading and specific parts of this reading will allow you to do so effectively by explaining the impacts of climate change on poverty. You can emphasize to your students how climate change indeed exacerbates poverty and therefore the vulnerabilities of the poor. Now you can have your students explore this topic further. They can use a feature story which is based on a report of the World Bank. This comprehensive report of the World Bank is titled Shockwaves: Managing the Impacts of Climate Change on Poverty. This contains some reading as well as a video micro lecture. Play the video titled Managing the Impacts of Climate Change on Poverty by the World Bank Group to highlight the need for policies to manage the effects of climate change in order to protect the poor, those that are most affected by it. You can read the associated text to emphasize to your students what might be measures taken to eradicate global poverty and how those can be thwarted by climate-related factors. Therefore, there is an urgent need to address climate change along with poverty, in conjunction with poverty alleviating development work. The infographic which is provided in this particular resource can be used to walk your students through the impacts of climate change on poor people, implications of inaction on climate change related factors for global poverty, and the ways to address both issues of poverty and climate change through climate smart development. Questions you can ask your student with this lesson plan. Define poverty. What is the vicious circle of poverty? It is the poor who are affected most by climate change. Do you agree? Explain the impact of climate change on poor women and children. How are the struggles against poverty and climate change interlinked? What policies are needed to mitigate climate change as well as reduce poverty? The learning outcomes. Using this lesson plan, your students will be able to identify poverty and climate change as two of the most important challenges for sustainable global development. They will be able to understand the causes of poverty and understand terms such as poverty trap or poverty cycle. They will be able to learn how poverty and climate change are related and understand how climate change has a more severe impact on poorer communities. They will be able to distinguish the ways in which men, women, and children are differently affected by poverty and climate change. If you or your students would like to explore this topic in greater detail, some of the additional resources shown here may be useful for you. See these and more lesson plans that integrate topics in economics with climate sciences at tropicsu.org and at the link shown here. Now, dear economics teachers, if you would like to use standalone teaching tools that not only explain topics in your discipline, but also improve the understanding of climate science or climate change amongst your students, you might want to take a look at some of the tools listed here. These could include a reading, which is a feature story based on the report of the World Bank that describes the threat of climate change to the poor people. A model or simulator which shows the relationship between climate change, economics, and various social factors. A set of reading resources to learn and understand the economics of climate change itself. A reading to learn about the economic analysis of climate change, various economic policies for climate change adaptation and mitigation. A short MOOC which is titled An Introduction to Result-Based Climate Finance. A reading to learn about the economics of Earth's environment and climate. A model and simulator to understand the prediction of peak global oil production. A model or simulator to learn about and use the Kaya identity to predict future carbon emissions, and many more. Let us take a look at some of these resources. A reading which is a list of books on climate change economics that has been developed by the Yale Climate Connections at the link shown here. These could include books such as The Climate Casino, Economic Risks of Climate Change, Capitalism versus the Climate, Natural Capital Valuing the Planet, Why Are We Waiting, Greening the Global Economy, Green Growth, Climate Shock, Environmentalism of the Rich, Introduction to Climate Change Economics, Donut Economics, and so on and so forth. A model or a simulator titled Climate Change, the Economy and Society, to understand the relationships between climate change, economics, and social factors. Using this model, your students can customize various parameters which are related to policies such as emissions-related taxes or treaties. They can also customize climate parameters such as levels of climate sensitivity, and they can certainly customize parameters that would be useful to you, those which are economic such as green growth and energy efficiency, and they can then observe what are the effects of climate change on the economy and society. This particular model is titled Web DICE. The DICE 2010 model is developed by Professor William Nordhaus of Yale University, is one of the most widely used models of the economics of climate change. He is incidentally also the Nobel laureate of economics. This has been developed by the Center for Robust Decision Making on Climate and Energy Policy, RDCEP, at the University of Chicago, and is available at the link shown here. A reading on the economic analysis of climate change and various economic policies for climate change adaptation and mitigation. Through this reading, your students will be able to discuss topics which are very large scale on the economics of global climate change itself. These can include readings and discussions about trends and projections for global climate, cost-benefit studies of global climate change, economic policies and policy tools, and analysis of current climate change policies. This reading has been developed by Professor Jonathan Harris, Brian Roach, and Marie Coder, and is available at the Global Development and Environment Institute's website at the link shown here. A reading to learn about the economics of Earth's environment and climate. Your students can discuss topics on the economics of the environment. These include different approaches used by economists to analyze environmental issues, various applications of economic theory to environmental issues, techniques for economic analysis of the environment, and different policy options. In this, your students can analyze environmental policies for various aspects of the environment, including climate change. Your students can answer questions such as define sustainability and value in the context of environmental economics, and you can compare regulated, unregulated markets when we look at economic efficiency and environment impacts. This reading is also developed by the same authors as the previous one, Brian Roach, Jonathan Harris, and Marie Coder, and is again hosted at the Global Development and Environmental Institute at Tufts University. A model or a simulator titled The Economics of Oil. This is to understand the prediction of peak global oil production and to learn about oil as an energy source, its peaks and reserves, and the economics and geopolitics of oil. Using this model or simulator, your students can customize parameters such as peak year, peak width, total reservoir size, and will be able to view the Hubbard curve that shows peak oil production. They can compare the generated curve with the data set for US oil production, global oil production, or whale oil production. This particular tool has been developed by David Archer of the University of Chicago, is present on the link shown here. And very briefly, for those who may not be fully aware of it, the idea of this particular model is based on Hubbard's peak. And his peak was that the rate of oil extraction from a particular field tends to follow a Gaussian or bell curve. There is no intrinsic reason why it should be so, and political, economic, and technological changes can actually in principle change of curve. But he observed it seemed to work in small fields, and he applied this method in the 50s to the time evolution of oil extraction from the US. So, using this, he predicted what is the time at which the US would reach peak oil production, and this can now also apply to the global oil production. So, this model is very useful if you are talking about energy usage, the economics of energy usage, with specifically looking at oil production, and you might find this useful in your classroom. So, dear economics teachers, we hope you have found these educational resources useful. We think and we hope you will use this in your classroom, and these tools, these lesson plans will not only increase the understanding of discipline-specific topics in economics, but will also lead to greater awareness of climate change amongst your students.